So the sport of motor racing is having a pretty intense discussion right now that has been sparked by three separate instances in the past few days of, in major series, cars crossing the line, taking the finish line and the checkered flag first, appearing to win races, and then subsequently being stripped of those wins either by disqualification or time penalties, and thus losing the race to a car that didn't win the race on track. And we are going to talk about these three separate incidents and whether or not A, the penalties are justified, and B, just kind of in general, whether or not racing should really go down this rabbit hole of, making it so restrictive and so regulated that, now, the third or fourth place car on track could end up being declared the winner days later. I mean, is that really the best thing for the sport? So obviously, this all kind of kicked off at the Canadian Grand Prix with Sebastian Vettel going off the track and going back on the track. That win went to Lewis Hamilton. Then we move over to the 24 Hours of Le Mans in the GTE-AM category with the Keating Motorsports wins, ironically named Ford GT, losing the win of the race due to some fuel issues. And there's a lot of confusion about that. We're going to explain that later in this video. And that car was eventually completely disqualified from the race, not just handed a time penalty like with Vettel. Another car completely disqualified from the race happened over in the NASCAR Truck Series, and that was Ross Chastain, one of the great stories of this year's NASCAR Truck Series, losing a win for the front of his truck being too low. That win was given to Brett Moffitt. So in this video, again, it's going to be up for discussion, so I want you guys to let me know your thoughts as loud and as boisterous as you want to be about wins being taken away and should they be taken away. But we're going to talk about each of these three specific instances in great detail, because the kind of scary thing about this is there really aren't a lot of similarities between these three instances, and they've also happened in three separate series, three completely different disciplines, but they've all happened on such a high level that you have to think that if this becomes the norm, it's going to be a trickle-down effect. So obviously, we're going to start where this whole kind of thing kicked off. The Canadian Grand Prix. Sebastian Vettel slides off the track in one of the chicanes at the Gilles Villeneuve circuit and comes back on the track. Now, Lewis Hamilton complained to the stewards that he felt that Vettel unsafely returned to the track and prevented him from making the pass. The stewards agreed and handed Vettel a 5-second penalty, handing the win to Hamilton. Now, interestingly enough, there have been some footage that has surfaced of Hamilton doing the same thing to Daniel Ricciardo in 2016. So, what do we think of it, or what do I think of this penalty? Because the internet reaction was pretty much across the board that Vettel didn't really do anything wrong. It was hard racing, and ultimately Vettel deserved to win the race, because it wasn't like Hamilton really gave up before the end of the race. He tried to pass him, he wasn't able to, despite knowing the time penalty. And ultimately, F1 was denied probably their best race of this year, in a heads-up, knockdown, drag-out fight between Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton. Vettel came out on top. That would have been Ferrari's first win of the year. It wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't a good look for Formula One, that's for sure. And once again, having another gigantic farce on American soil, or not American soil, but North American soil, in this time zone, I should say. They always want the North American audience, but it seems like you always have things like the Tire Gate or Barrichello being given a win by Michael Schumacher, and then now this with, it's almost kind of living up to the stereotype that you hear people who don't watch F1 talk about F1, that, oh, well, they can't race, oh, they can't pass, oh, they give stupid penalties. Well, F1 a lot of times will prove that stereotype right, and it's just very sad to see. So I was actually one of the people that knew this penalty was coming. I looked at it, as soon as I saw it, I said, that's going to be a penalty, they're going to penalize him. I don't. A lot of people say it's Hamilton bias. I don't know if it's Hamilton bias. I don't really see the benefit for Formula One as a sport. Let's just assume the stewards are in Lewis Hamilton's pocket. I don't see the benefit to letting him just, run roughshod on the field and just win all the races. That isn't going to help, interest in the sport. If the fix was in, you'd almost think that they wouldn't call a penalty on Vettel. It's just that kind of thing where you see, it just felt like it was going to be a penalty. I don't know how to describe it any better than that. It was like, looking at the reaction, especially of Hamilton on the radio, it was like, yeah, they're going to call a penalty. They did. It was 5 seconds. I almost wish, if they had called a penalty, it would have been, and this would have been better for the show too, by the way, if they had said Vettel has to give up the position, but it's not a time penalty situation, so it actually would have still been a race, and Vettel would have been able to re-earn the victory. But the way it worked out was with a time penalty in 5 seconds in modern racing, that's an eternity. Even in Formula One, Vettel almost lost third place to his teammate Charles Leclerc. And, I'm not surprised that they gave the penalty. I think it's absolutely the wrong decision. Because again, this was the knockdown drag-out fight that everybody's kind of wanted since Australia in Formula One, where you have Vettel, you have Hamilton, you have the two best, most accomplished drivers in the series, in the two best teams, and the cars are relatively evenly matched, and you're going to have the last stint, because it was truly the last tire stint, because it was a one-stop race in Canada. This was going to be the knockdown dragout. You were going to get to see who was the better driver, and they managed to screw it up. And it's like, oh boy. So yeah, I completely agree with the internet on this one. I think, even though I know why they gave the penalty, yeah, I would certainly like to see Formula One kind of. And I don't know how you do it because I don't think Formula One, a lot of people were saying this, like Formula One needs to become IndyCar or go spec or something like that. No. That's not Formula One. But I also don't think it's Formula One to call a penalty on a driver re-entering the track trying to win the race. I don't think it was malicious by Vettel, even though the FIA has shown data to say, oh, well, Vettel did this and Vettel did that. Again, this was one that I think was a black eye on the sport for sure. So now we head to Le Mans and the GTE-AM controversy with the Wins Ford GT. Now, I didn't explain this very well yesterday in This Week in Racing, and there seemed to be a lot of confusion in the comments, even from what I explained. So this is what happened. This comes from the FIA. So there is a minimum 45 seconds of refueling time on each pit stop. So the Ford was determined to have gone 44.4 seconds. So they were 6/10 off on each pit stop, or they were 6/10 faster than they were allowed to be refueling the car under the rules. So that penalty was assessed at 55 seconds, which stuck them second in the class. In real money, talking about what an advantage this actually was for the Ford GT, they stopped 23 times in 24 hours and gained, theoretically, 13.8 seconds of time over 24 hours because of that fuel flow restriction and the fact that they had gone faster than it. The thing that stripped them completely of any finishing position in this year's 24 Hours of Le Mans was that the fuel tank was 0.1 liters too large. And over the course of 24 hours with 23 pit stops, that gave the Wins Ford GT 2.3 extra liters of fuel over the rest of the field. Okay. Looking at it in real money, the fuel capacity thing, 2.3 liters of fuel. I think I saw that the maximum capacity at Le Mans, at least for the GTE-AM cars, was 93 liters. So 2.3, and remember, that's over 24 hours, is such a relatively small thing. That surprises me a significant amount that was what threw them out of the race entirely. And looking at the actual refueling speed, the 6/10 per pit stop, eventually turning into 13 seconds. You would have thought that that would have been the penalty, considering how much time they gained because of that, that would have been the thing that threw them out of the race, but it was the opposite. They only demoted the Wins 4 GT for gaining 13 seconds of illegal time. And here's the thing, and here's what it comes down to. I mean, and this is the thing that I've had some debates with friends over the weekend about this, is that everybody wants, or not everybody wants, but a lot of people are advocating. I don't want to say everybody. A lot of people are advocating for BOP across the board for racing. And balance of performance, which of course is what BOP stands for, works in some categories. I'm not even going to BS with you here. GT3 is a great example. I mean, it is essentially $500,000 go-kart racing, because ultimately a GT3 car with doctors and lawyers driving them, the idea is you want to keep it fun for these guys so they keep coming back. I understand where BOP works. And even to a certain extent in GTE-AM, even if it's at the world's greatest endurance race, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, even in GTE-AM it makes sense. For pro categories, it's I wish it was completely gone, because another 4GT, the 68, which finished 4th in class in the pro category, which is for the factory teams and or the teams that feel strongly enough to that they want to hire all pro driver lineups and go into that class. They were disqualified too, and for very similar issues to what the Wins car was. And I look at this and it's so ticky-tack. I mean, the fact that the fuel flow time is mandated, and that a difference of 2.3 liters of fuel over 24 hours was deemed enough to throw 2 cars out of the race. And then you add on to the fact that the Aston Martin got taken out of the race before it even began because they made the egregious mistake of qualifying their car on the pole, and then were given a BOP adjustment to take them out of the race for some reason. And now this stuff is going to be in the top class. With hypercars, and credit to IMSA, they do have BOP, but I don't remember a whole lot of cars getting thrown out of the race for any kind of. I mean, the last real example of this was the Land Motorsport Audi. I think they got thrown out of Watkins Glen and of Daytona last year, but again, that was in a GT3 class, so I don't know. And before you say, well, maybe it only will happen in the GT division, well, let's go over to Silverstone with the LMP1 cars and Toyota. Toyota were thrown out of the Silverstone race entirely, and that's a non-BOP class. So maybe it's not totally BOP, but to say that maybe it would have only happened, or I guess I'm arguing against myself here a little bit by saying, well, they only throw cars out in BOP series. But it seems like BOP kind of adds more to this over. It's ultimately just way. I mean, again, the thing that really frustrates me is the fuel flow rate, gaining 0.6 of a second. I mean, it's a big gap, no doubt about it. But my question at the beginning is, why are you mandating fuel flow rates to begin with? And I guess it's a safety issue, but if it's a safety issue, why are you allowing the teams to change tires and refuel at the same time when that was a rule that was changed so that you had to change tires and fuel separately because that was a safety issue? That was 10 years ago when they still had marshals running across the track when it was green. They didn't have the full course yellow procedure that they have now. I mean, all these things. I mean, it's just, I don't know what needs to be done here, but I certainly don't think the Wins car should have been thrown out of the race entirely. The win taken away, maybe you could argue that. I don't necessarily disagree with it, but boy, are these some small margins, and I guess you have to draw a line somewhere. But, I mean, they had the field covered regardless, I think. I think they probably would have won the race anyway. It wasn't like they got passed very much during the race. So this is one I struggle with quite a bit. And finally, Ross Chastain became the first NASCAR driver to lose a race after winning it on track in a NASCAR race since 1960. Again, for his truck was just a little bit too low on the front of the car. Now, it's important to note that the Xfinity Series and the Truck Series have mandated ride height levels. The Cup Series does not. And this also means, again, because Ross Chastain is racing for the Truck Series championship, and because of how NASCAR works, if you win a race, you're in the championship, assuming you qualify in the top 20 in points, but not having very many points to take away from this race, as well as losing that win, severely damages Ross Chastain's chances to compete for a truck championship. Now, again, the NASCAR regulations changed this year to make it so that cars or trucks under NASCAR sanction, were they determined to have breached the rules post-race, they were liable or subject to get thrown out of the race. So this has happened. This is the first time this has happened. Many people were expecting it to happen in the Truck Series, and specifically, many people were expecting it to happen to Kevin Harvick. But that's not what happened. It happened to Ross Chastain, a fan favorite, a small team, and a great story. So naturally, people are going to be a little bit more biased on this one than they otherwise would be. So, in the spirit of the rule, I completely agree that Ross Chastain should have been thrown out of this race. I hate it for him, because I'm a fan of Ross Chastain. I mean, he's been screwed so many times, and he's been screwed here again. I mean, and he did win the race. I mean, how much of an impact did that ride height have on him, whether or not he won the race? I think that's a very legitimate question. But rules is rules, and I guess I have to commend NASCAR for being willing to take a win away. Now, here's the thing that I will question. A, would they do this for the Cup Series? And B, would they do this for a popular Cup Series driver such as Chase Elliott or even a Brad Keselowski or a Joey Logano, somebody like that? Would they actually do it? Maybe they would. I know they were very upfront and willing to encumber wins, but of course, remember, that didn't take the win away. And something NASCAR was pretty wise to do throughout their history was they always had a policy outside of Sonoma and a couple of the yellow line rule issues, is that the car that the fans see cross the line and get the checkered flag always wins the race. Now, they changed this because in modern motorsports, we kind of have a much more close connection to what goes on, and we have things like Reddit and YouTube and Twitter. If fans catch on to something that maybe looks a little bit shady, like the Harvick rear window last year, you know, that can spread like wildfire, and NASCAR can take action when maybe otherwise they could have swept things under the rug. Ride height? It does seem a little bit anal, doesn't it? And I just, again, I agree with it. Here's the thing, especially for NASCAR. I don't know if you could do this in sports cars or Formula One, but NASCAR needs a much better inspection process prior to the race. If they need to tear down cars before the race, that's when it should be done. They shouldn't be tearing down cars after the race, because I think it's bad for the fans. And if a car can't pass inspection before the race, just throw it out. That's when I think cars should be thrown out of the race, beforehand and not afterwards. And I think that's where NASCAR, I think I would like to see them change it. And in fact, I'd like to see all these series change that. Now, obviously, the Formula One thing, that happened in the race. That was a kind of a split-second decision to have to make on the fly. But the rest of these things, when you take wins away because you find something in tech after the race, well, why didn't you find that in tech before? I mean, going back to the Le Mans thing, one of the biggest traditions at Le Mans is the pre-race scrutineering, which means pre-race tech. They didn't find that the fuel tank was over capacity then? How? It's ridiculous. So I'd like to see all these. I mean, I don't want to see any of this because I don't think this is what anybody wants to be talking about. I don't think it generates business. I think it turns people off. But at the same time, I do think rules should be enforced. I think there's just better ways to enforce them. But again, let me know down in the comment section below. I'm sure this will be an interesting discussion. So thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube, and we'll see you in the next video.